Hello folks, and welcome to the Rifle Company Butterworth podcast. My name is Sean Arthur, and I am one of the 9,000 Rifle Company Butterworth veterans who served Butterworth Air Force Base in Malaysia during the Cold War. It is an odd term, isn't it? Cold War. Military confrontation forever at the edge of destruction, and armed enemies facing each other, always awaiting the first shot to be fired. And many times, the Cold War accidentally turned on the hot tap. In this series, we are going to explore the hidden story of one of the longest conflicts in Australian Army's military history. In duration, it was second only to the war in Afghanistan. Australia was involved in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021, almost 20 years. However, long before Afghanistan, there was another long conflict that lasted from 1970 to 1989, a full 19 years. Weirdly, this conflict has been erased from the Australian Defence Force military record, or should I say, it was never permitted to enter the record in the first place. This was Rifle Company Butterworth, that is RCB's long defence of the Air Force Base in Butterworth, situated in northern Malaysia. I apologise in advance. You'll be hearing a lot of those three little letters, RCB. If it is any consolation, and it won't be, they have been buzzing inside my head for decades. As we go along, you'll hear many, many acronyms. I also sincerely apologise for this. We are talking about the military, after all, and they twist everything into unrecognisable shapes. A simple tin mug becomes cups, canteen, service for the use of. Nothing is ever straightforward. I will introduce only the most central bunch of letters as they are thrown into the mix. For today we have RCB, already mentioned, but we also have ABB for Airbase Butterworth, and we have DHAT, DHAAT, for Defence Honours and Awards Appeals Tribunal. And of course, we have CTs for Communist Terrorists. These were the guys who were our enemy. On the subject of acronyms and nicknames, one of the most important things to remember is that the Australian soldier is informally called Digger. Why Digger? Well, nobody knows exactly why, but a great many claim authoritative knowledge on the subject. What we do know is that it was first recorded about 1916 and 1917 on the Western Front during World War I. It may have been an artefact from the goldfields 60 years previous to that. Some claim it was used freely amongst the Victorian Eureka Stockade rebels, who were all gold miners, and became associated with, somehow, the Australian soldiers' fighting spirit. So it may be associated to either trench fighting or gold mining. There were lots of digging in either case. And by the end of the First World War, even New Zealanders were called diggers, but thereafter they became identified as Kiwis and named after their famous fruit. But for that matter, kiwi fruit is not even native to New Zealand, and I'd rather not stir up any controversies beyond the volcano that is RCB service. Diggers are what Australian soldiers call each other, and it is what officers and NCOs call the troops. However, soldiers don't refer to officers or NCOs as diggers, even though they most certainly are. There is a protocol involved. It has a lot to do with the concept of mateship, which, in an Australian context, is yet another rabbit hole best left undisturbed. The Australian Defence Force has long been extremely hostile to any recognition of RCB as a warlike operation, even though the evidence is blunt, unmistakable, and now readily available. Why they have taken this position is still a mystery, and it has led to many theories, some of which we will explore in later episodes. Early in the 2000s, the department has been on the front foot in denying recognition, actively so. In the early years, RCB veteran groups had a great difficulty in proving our case because the evidence was still largely classified and therefore unavailable. What public information was at hand became ingrained inside a 50-year deception fed to the Australian public as part of a deliberate misinformation campaign. However, over the years, decades really, the RCB veteran groups have been steadily scratching away at the official deception and uncovering an unexceptional truth. Fortunately for the veterans, the evidence being uncovered are actual records belonging to the Australian Defence Department. These are the documents where the authorities, both civil and military, talk plainly about their little war problem. You see, Australia had expensive Air Force assets, that is, fighter and transport aircraft, just sitting in the middle of a civil war, 7,000 kilometres away from Canberra, and at the time, it was a cause for great concern. Perhaps one historical reason that RCB service caused problems, and are still causing problems to this day, is because neither the counter-revolutionary operations nor the conflict itself fitted neatly inside a conventional war design. The bones of RCB service were bog-standard, warlike, operational, of the kind that existed prior to the Malaysian conflict, and still existed long after the conflict ended in 1989. As a current example, Myanmar, formerly Burma, has 18 separate insurgent fighting groups in existence. Most of these are still active today. You will find like examples throughout Australia's military history, many of which we will outline in later episodes. The Defence Department's response to look-alike examples was deliberative silence on the question. The veterans produced a comparison matrix of prior conflicts for the DHAT Tribunal, and also for the Department to analyse and offer comment. The comparison matrix broke down all the relevant characteristics from multiple warlike conflicts that Australians have been engaged in, and we compared them to each other. If you look at it, there was little to no difference evident in just about any of them. The DHAT Tribunal even directed the Department to provide a comparison matrix of their own to demonstrate that RCB service was not warlike. It never happened. The Defence Department refused to comply. The Department offered excuses and just avoided direct comparisons with every fibre of their being. The fact that highly trained and experienced military lawyers avoided arguing the toss with a bunch of old and fat RCB veterans tells you all you need to know about the official position. Any cursory or even detailed comparison between recognised Australian warlike conflicts would reveal no discernible difference between RCB and that of any other warlike operation. So yes, RCB service was almost identical to many other historical military warlike conflicts. However, the outer perimeter of RCB service was most definitely unorthodox, and that's putting it mildly. Let us examine some of the differences between RCB service and the more conventional warlike operations. RCB in-country tours in Malaysia were generally 3 months in duration. Short military operational tours are not usually the norm in Australian history, but nor are they unheard of either. The SAS squadron durations in Afghanistan were all over the shop, with some experiencing 12-month tours, some 6-month, and some 4-month tours. So tour duration is not, obviously, a determining factor for warlike service. The tour was, well, the tour, and it depended entirely upon the military needs and military objectives. For different reasons, some military tours are shorter and sometimes they are longer. Secondly, RCB infantry did not openly engage in contact operations with our enemy. Specifically, We never experienced Australian soldiers killed or wounded due to enemy action, nor did we fire upon the communist terrorists, the CTs, and nor did we inflict casualties upon them. I say this, and I say it plainly, just to lay RCB's historical record on the table. RCB service was not Gallipoli, nor was it Long Tan, or any other famous battle. RCB veterans are not pretending that it was. However, we were sent to a war zone with particular military objectives, and we were prepared to defend that airbase with our lives. That was the job, that was the role. If the stated clandestine reason at the time was training, then so be it. However, the second Malaysian emergency has been over now for 36 years. The time has long passed when appropriate acknowledgement should be addressed and recognition of the service of Northern Malaysia rendered. As I said, it is not our intention to misrepresent our service, and nor do we need to. We were never in active contact with the CTs, as they were called. Our presence in Butterworth meant being 100% engaged in either preventing an attack on the airbase or taking back the airbase. In later episodes, I will outline how this was achieved, but our role was reactive rather than preemptive, such as was the case in, say, Timor-Leste. There are reasons for this particular defensive stance, mainly political at the time. But allowing the enemy to initiate contact goes against every principle of warfare, going back to the Chinese general and military philosopher Sun Tzu in 570 BC. One never, ever gives an advantage to the enemy. Our war was defensive, and we were not supposed to operate beyond the boundaries of the airbase, or beyond the wire, as we termed it. However, we operated beyond the wire all the time, as some vital points, that's VPs, another acronym, required protection, and they were actually beyond the wire. On several occasions, RCB soldiers were even sent far outside the wire, and quite intentionally, to protect crashed Australian RAAF aircraft from the enemy. The 2023 DHAT Tribunal struggled with these facts because it pushed their concluding narrative of non-warlike service so far underwater that the facts almost drowned. What we were left with officially was that the RCB never operated outside the wire, except on all the occasions on which we did. So anyway, is a military defensive stance indicative of non-warlike service? It would seem not. Many times Australian soldiers had a defensive role and were still officially considered warlike. Urbon in Thailand and Diego Garcia weren't even in the same country as their enemy, yet their service was recognised as warlike, as it should be. East Timor in 1999 was correctly acknowledged as warlike. Although it was classed as a peacekeeping operation, 6 soldiers still died, though none on combat operations. In East Timor, Australian soldiers could not initiate contact willy-nilly either. They had very similar rules of engagement, ROE, another acronym. They had to follow them just as we did. In Butterworth, we, the RCB, were definitely not peacekeepers. We even had an ROE conditions where we could act independently in recovering the airbase from attack. More about the ROE later, because it is a complicating yet vital component of our warlike service. It was the ROE that caused no end of confused nonsense for the DHAT Tribunal when they were trying to square an impossible circle in 2023. Thirdly, probably one of the strangest facts about RC operations when compared to other conflicts is that Australia, yes Australia, the very same country that sent us halfway across the world to defend a joint Malaysian RAAF airbase, is now so committed to denying it ever happened in the first place. Originally, the denial was political and pragmatic. The government was stuck in an awkward forked stick. Lies had to be told, fair enough. Bringing the troops home was the political promise, but leaving them in a war zone was the reality. Also, Malaysia was dead set against an open military commitment from Australia. It had to remain unacknowledged. The Malaysians wanted to demonstrate their own strength and their own capability in dealing with a dangerous communist insurgency. Nothing shows weakness more than having white soldiers coming back and fighting your enemies for you. Don't forget, Malaysia as a country was officially only 13 years old when the RCB first arrived at their doorstep. Openly having Australians defend your military assets was like, say, inviting your drunken uncle to try and quiet a noisy party next door. It sends a certain message that you are not in control and that you still need external propping up. Not that we were even the first to arrive. The Brits and the Kiwis were also gate crashing at Butterworth in turn from the 1960s. But from 1970, it was an Australian reinforced rifle company who took up residence, and we stayed there for the next 19 years. And the real reason for our being there was kept under wraps from that day to this. And the question is, why? Another way that RCB stands out as being, well, different was that our deployments were not a full battalion in strength. Usually, Australia sent at least a battalion into war zones, and sometimes we sent whole brigades and with full supporting arms. But rarely did we dispatch less than a battalion on operational deployments. RCB, as the name suggests, was a reinforced rifle company, that is, a subunit of a battalion. So rather than the 600 to 700 men of a battalion, we sent in a rifle company of only about 120 men on 3-month deployments. We were sent in to perform the specific task of defending the airbase against enemy attack. That was it. It should be noted that RCB were not airfield guards, that is, statically deployed troops scattered about here and there. RCB was a reaction force, fully armed, including machine guns, who mounted a 24-hour quick reaction force, QRF. Sorry, another acronym, QRF, Quick Reaction Force. Our primary role was to counterattack any hostile threat. We specifically were not a peacekeeping force. It wasn't our job to insert ourselves between the opposing combatants. We ourselves were the combatants. Our ROE, Rules of Engagement, just stipulated that the RCB must operate within certain bounds and that we could only either engage in a non-compliant intrusion or an attacking force. Informally speaking, we could only legally operate inside the wire. There were also plenty of times when we actually sent armed soldiers outside the wire for military objectives. In at least 2 cases, the RAAF commander of the airbase sent armed RCB troops out to protect crashed RAAF aircraft. At least one of these occasions, the downed Mirage fighter was at 10 kilometres from the base. As you would know, 10 clicks is pretty much outside the bounds of legal ROE protection. The tribunal ignored these incidents because, well, how could they be squeezed inside the self-protection box that the tribunal was trying to build? We were only supposed to operate inside the wire, remember? It really should have been the Malaysian Armed Forces who were dispatched on this tasking, but apparently the RAAF base commander wanted Australian bayonets out in the sticks, not Malaysian conscripts. The last, and perhaps most damaging anomaly, was after the Communist Party leader, Chin Peng, surrendered his forces in December 1989, the RCB continued its presence as a genuine training posting for Australian soldiers. On the 2nd of December 1989, the Operational Quick Reaction Force, QRF, handed in its live ammunition and stood down forever. The base amber alerts, which indicated increased danger, ceased, and peace settled over the airbase. The war footing that the RCB had maintained for almost 2 decades unceremoniously ended only a couple of days after the CT surrender. Ever since that day, RCB began peacetime training rotations, and this pure training development seriously contaminated its former role as wartime fighters. A generation of peacetime soldiering in Butterworth has now become synonymous with adventure training and little else. RAAF and Army officers who weren't even born at the time of the surrender today have little knowledge and even less understanding of one of Australia's longest running military deployments. What's more, instead of celebrating the successful deterrence in what was a hideous civil war, the entire conflict, and RCB's participation in it has never made it into the country's military history. Today, according to the Australian Defence Department, Australia had no involvement at all in the second Malaysian emergency. Apparently, we had no enemy, and apparently the threat to the airbase was minimal. We were there, also apparently, purely for training, and our security role was supposedly non-existent. This point of view is demonstratively wrong, as the now available records prove. It's often been reported quite incorrectly that the Australian Vietnam veterans received no welcome home on return from their individual deployments. In truth, every single infantry battalion returning from Vietnam was welcomed back with a rapturous march through their home city. Sure, there were also protests in the later years, but the reality was that these protests were rather muted and never really popular with mainstream Australians. There was an ugly incident in 1966 where a young woman doused herself in red paint and ran into the parading battalion, but this was the exception, not the rule. The myth seemed to have started around 1982 and has grown ever larger since, but in truth, every single battalion returned home with an official welcome. We have them all recorded on film, every last one. The Vietnam vets might not have experienced much else in the early years, but at least they had that. By contrast, every rifle company returning back from Butterworth got a few days' leave and then went straight back to garrison duties with their parent battalion. Their effort unacknowledged, and it remains unacknowledged to this day. Australian defence officials, senior military officers and government ministers declared themselves mystified by the RCB veterans' long battle for recognition. Why do we persist? They asked themselves. The answer is short and sweet. RCB did its duty and we are through with asking nicely. We want this proven fact acknowledged. In the long years since the communist terrorists surrendered in 1989, a movement amongst the RCB veterans slowly began growing. After I returned from Malaysia at the beginning of 1979, nothing much happened. Our deployment with the RCB did not warrant a service medal in those days, nor any other recognition was apparent at the time. My Malaysian tour did go into my service record, but then so did everything of little consequence. Items such as disciplinary charges, inoculations, professional development, and promotion courses. But I felt the burden of my RCB experience every day. It changed my life irrevocably. I didn't experience post-traumatic stress disorder, at least I don't think that I did, but I was still psychologically changed. On my return to Australia, I still had 4 years to go before my army contract was complete. On my return, however, I found regular training boring. I was supposed to be at the peak of my army career. Promotion was beckoning, but I just couldn't get into it. So I applied for a transfer from Townsville to a battalion in Brisbane, and I was sent to 89 RAR, Royal Australian Regiment, at the end of the year. The next 3 years, I admit, I pretty much wasted. I completed all my promotion courses with ease and acted as my section's second in command for the remainder of my Army career. But I never sought promotion, nor was I considered for it. I still took bushcraft and my infantry role seriously as I possibly could. But back in the battalion, between exercises, I was a pain in the platoon's butt. I was a joker, the camp slacker. I was, that guy. And every platoon had one. I earned extra duties as punishment all the time. I played up just enough to ruin weekends with extra duties, but not enough really to stain my service records. When we were set back into the bush, I switched on again, and I was a professional infantryman once more. But the RCB thing, it was eating me out from the inside. Did it really happen? There was hardly any external evidence that I was even there, or the fact that we put our lives on the line even without engaging the enemy. But it did happen, damn it. I remember sitting in on an annual performance review with my new platoon commander, who was fresh out of Duntroon. He noted the RCB service on my record. He asked, what was all that about? He didn't know. Even if the conflict was ongoing and still had 9 years to go, he still didn't know. And why would he know? Unless you were there yourself, it was mostly invisible, even in the battalion. Occasionally, you would bump into another RCB veteran in your travels. But I can't remember having a single worthwhile reminiscence, even once, with another RCB vet. You might talk about your favourite bar in Penang. It was inevitably the Hong Kong bar, but that was it. It was still deeply unsettling to have experienced a unique warlike service and yet nobody knew about it. And those few who did, didn't really care. I got out of the army at the beginning of 1982. I remember reading, a full 7 years later, that the CT leader, Chin Peng, had surrendered to the Malaysian and Thai governments. At the time I wondered how he was able to surrender. According to my own government, there was never a war in the first place. We were there defending the RAAF air base against nobody, and the Rifle Company Butterworth successfully held off an attack for 19 years against what the Australian Defence Department now claim were ghosts. One thing is certain, somebody is lying. So it was either us, the 9,000 veterans who defended the airbase, or it was the defence bureaucracy. In the very beginning, the veterans didn't even have any proof, as all the incriminating evidence was bundled up in highly classified documents. However, as the years rolled on, such archives became eligible for declassification and release, not all at once, mind you, but the data trickle would eventually become a stream, and that stream a river. Thereafter, the Defence Department's sticky version of history would begin to look ridiculous. One last caveat. I've written this podcast with a non-service person in mind. I will assume no prior knowledge on your part, even though it's possible that you already know a great deal about it. But what has occupied my mind a great deal is that to modern sensibilities, this weird story may not completely land with the listener. It is a generation thing, and there is no beating around the bush about it. Exploring history is like time travel. It's not always obvious why back in the day people did certain things, felt certain things, and were motivated by certain things. And I'm not even talking about the negative rhetoric with the boomer or millennial generations. None of this is pejorative. Life was much simpler in the days before social media. Humankind's total knowledge wasn't available in a small rectangle in your pants pocket. People were told stuff, and they tended to just accept that stuff. The 6 p.m. news was mandatory in every Australian household in the country, and compared to today, the media was pretty straight shooting. National legends assumed an importance back then in ways that today would seem quaint. but the legends we were brought up on were very powerful stuff, at least to us. While younger generations may well scoff at us old farts, we ourselves didn't know any better. Worse still, we never even wanted to know better, because that assumes an imagination yet unrealised to suburban teenagers of the time. My father was still fighting in the northern coast of Papua New Guinea against Japanese when the Second World War ended. His father fought in France during World War I. In a family of 4 siblings, 3 of us kids entered military service. Both our parents did the same before us. Yes, even my mother joined the army. My older sister even served in the RAAF and did time at Butterworth as well. Serving one's country was what we believed in, and we believed it as a worthy virtue in itself. When I joined the army in the mid-70s, this national idealism was definitely under threat following the Vietnam War debacle. But enough still remained that I had a burning pride in wearing the slouch hat. This definitely sounds corny to today's ears, I get it. But serving was a sign that I had achieved the pinnacle of my life's ambition. All these years later, RCB is still the core of our military existence. It remains the primitive nucleus of our collective personalities. We can't undo our RCB service and wouldn't want to, even if we could. So we prepared for an infantry service posting in what was an active and ongoing civil war. And we prepared to defend that little patch of Australian military obligation in a distant land. In doing so, you can be sure that we would do whatever it was that had to be done. I didn't want to shoot anyone, and I certainly didn't want to be shot at, but that wasn't up to us to decide. The army sent us to Butterworth. We didn't pick it out of a tourist brochure. We even understood why the RC operation had to remain covert. We played the game as it was explained to us. However, the game ended in December 1989 when the CT surrendered. There was no need for pretense anymore. Yet the government remained silent. It refused to acknowledge the ancient agreement between a country and its soldiers. If we are bitter about it, we have good reasons. So I guess the question is, will you, the detached listener, objectively get it? It is a lot to ask of you. If you are of a younger generation, you are, without doubt, more sophisticated and more worldly than we were at your age. You probably have travelled internationally, and you have experienced things that we would possibly never have thought possible. Can you, dear listener, time travel back to a world bounded by improbable stories told by your teachers and parents, where a father goes to work and a mother stays at home? That is the norm. A land where a single wage earner can buy a 3-bedroom house in the inner suburbs. It is definitely a strange and distant land. It just doesn't exist in today's Australia and hasn't for a very long time. In the end, I will do my best to make the RCB experience accessible to you. We really owe it to you, but also for Australian history's sake. It is not your fault that the government prefers the dark, where we want disinfecting sunlight. In any case, thanks for coming on this journey with us, and from all of us, we hope you get something out of the story. In the next episode, we will leave the RCB behind for just a little bit and explore what an Australian infantryman's life was like in the 1970s, how we were trained, our specific fighting role, and explain the build-up to our deployment in Malaysia. It will be a bit of a tour de force for one of Australia's combat arms of service. The next episode will be designed to inform the non-soldier of the realities and also the tediousness of our everyday world. No doubt, many things will have improved in the decades since, but for the simple grunt on the ground in the 1970s, the basic existence can't have changed all that much. If you had no direct experience living the life of an infantryman, all this will make future chapters easier to digest. One of the problems that RCB veterans have experienced is that global assumptions keep getting made. We keep assuming that people know. Most of these assumptions lack clarity, and some of them are just plainly wrong. Thank you for listening to the RCB podcast. We are privileged that you have taken an interest in this part of our military and political history, as so very few have. We have nothing on our side other than public opinion to help us. Nobody in government cares. This has been a production of the RCB Veterans Group. The podcast was written and produced by myself, Sean Arthur. I would especially like to thank the tireless efforts of the RCB Research Group, who have brought a level of professionalism in driving our collective efforts to the government's doorstep. I would also like to thank the RCB Veterans Group, who have been taking on the veteran fight for a very, very long time, especially in a period when the RCB space was mostly vacant. Both veteran groups have shown no lessening of resolve, even as the years roll on. And lastly, with continuing thanks to the 9,000 Australian Army veterans who served in RCB between 1970 and 1989. Thank you all, and thanks for listening.